Perhaps the biggest criticism of the millennials and to a lesser extent Gen Z that's kind of been lobbed at us by the baby boomers and Gen X is that we're the Peter Pan generation. If you're familiar at all with the tale of Peter Pan is a boy who flew away to Neverland so he would never have to grow up. And the idea is that millennials are uniquely childish in that they did not become adults, or we didn't become adults in the same way that previous generations did. We didn't have to go and fight in World War One or World War Two. We didn't have to do whatever it was the baby boomers did that made them into adults. We're kind of this unique generation that just never grew up, and we're all still kind of children and dependent upon mom and dad. And this kind of gets back to, I think, one of the eternal issues in just kind of, I don't know if you kind of call it human civilization. This idea of were things better in the olden days and are things uniquely terrible now? I think there's a tendency as part of both our personal and societal kind of psyche to repress bad memories, to repress bad feelings, to kind of put aside the things that give us pain. And so, to a certain extent, I think we often, when we look back at the past, we only kind of see the good aspects of it or the neutral aspects of it. And a lot of the issues we faced during that time period have just kind of faded into obscurity as kind of like a psychological coping mechanism. That's not to say some ages aren't worse than others, and that the challenges we face today are not in some ways worse than previous ages, but in some ways they're better than previous ages. Maybe to kind of explain this a little better, there's an Adam Smith quote I really like. So this was after the surrender of British forces at Saratoga, when the Revolutionary War was kind of turning against them. A Sir John Sinclair stated, "If we go on at this rate, the nation must be ruined." To which Adam Smith said, "Be assured, young friend, there is a great deal of ruin in a nation." Meaning, at least in my interpretation, there's always a crisis. There's always somebody destroying something. There's always a nation by its virtue of being this big complicated thing, much like a person being this complicated thing. There's always a lot of flaws in it. There's always a lot of fractures in it. So the fact that millennials and Gen Z face certain challenges that are maybe different than the previous generations is the most normal thing in the world. Every age faces different challenges. Some are better, some are worse. But it's kind of this meme or this thing that millennials are uniquely bad, that they're kind of uniquely the worst generation ever. And I guess to a certain extent, that's something we lob back at boomers, that they were actually the worst generation. But the point being, these things are just very difficult to kind of determine. That being said, let's just maybe take a step back and take a look at this whole, what the concept of adulthood is. So I don't mean to be a postmodernist here, but adulthood to a certain extent is a social construct. That is adulthood is kind of whatever society deems adulthood to be. And this can change over time, and it's not always appropriate to take one standard and apply it universally to the others. So, I mean, there are certain things in history that are universal to most societies. That is, there is an objective underlying of what it means to be an adult, to be legally responsible for your actions, both criminally and civilly, to be independent to a certain extent, to take an active role in society. If you're a male, I guess, to participate in military service. But a lot of aspects of this really differ from period to period. Like, traditionally, you were expected to get married. It depends upon the era and what your class are. But let's say you get married in your early 20s to a woman who's probably a couple of years younger than you, and then you have like 5 or 6 children. And that was kind of your duty as an adult, was to get married at around that age and have those children. In societies that practice conscription, oftentimes the transition to adulthood is marked by serving your tour of duty in the army. And I mean, as you go through it in different ages, there's different types of transitions, like from being a page to being a squire to being a knight. Within the Roman aristocracy or the Roman upper class, there's the idea of the beginning of your public life, that you start off working your way throughout the bureaucracy and throughout the various administrative positions to hopefully eventually become consul. And once you kind of started climbing the curses on Rome, that's when you became an adult. And the age at which you become an adult varies very wildly from place to place. That the qualifications depends upon class, it depends upon status, depends upon what the life expectancy of the time is. These things are all very complicated. And as I said, it really depends upon how society defines childhood and society defines adulthood. So my point being, maybe a certain extent of this is just a bit of confusion as to how much society has changed since the baby boomers were born. Maybe just it's kind of their kind of context and their understanding of what it is to be an adult is just something very different from it is today. And this kind of disconnect might make them think, oh, well, they haven't fulfilled X, Y, and Z. So millennials are babies. But is that necessarily the case, or is it just that there's kind of some different things that have happened? And I mean, if you look at it from a millennial perspective, and that's kind of more what I'm looking at it from, a lot of millennials and Gen Z grew up during the financial recession. They grew up during a time period in which entry level jobs largely disappeared. A lot of things that baby boomers had enjoyed, such as pensions and good health insurance and job security and vacation days and all this other sort of thing, had kind of started to fade into the background. So when our generation looks at baby boomers and maybe how their spending habits are, that they don't really bother to save any money because they're going to have a good pension when they retire or something like that, or just kind of the amount of money they'll blow on like their lawns and their big houses in the suburbs and taking out like 5 mortgages and like the expensive status signaling trips. We kind of see that, I guess, from our perspective in a lot of cases as being a sign that they aren't grown up, that they're kind of man children who haven't really learned financial responsibility and haven't really learned that part of being an adult is being able to delay gratification, to be able to kind of control your desires in favor of maintaining your financial health. A lot of millennials and Gen Z, and it doesn't really matter if they're on the left or the right, view the baby boomers as kind of a wishy-washy generation. They're a generation who were kind of briefly rebellious in the 1960s, and they've never really decided on whether or not they stand for anything. Like they'll pay lip service to like diversity or multiculturalism or something like that, but they won't actually, generally speaking, live around it. They'll advocate for drugs and free love and stuff, but if their kids ever get involved with any of that, they get really upset. And to, like I said, to millennials, be they social justice warriors or alt-right or libertarian or whatever, it just seems like boomer politics are just different different shades of kind of the same bland generic centrism. And we kind of see this inability to really kind of view the world in a, I guess you could say, like a moral way, like in kind of a moral bigger sets, and to kind of say, this is what I believe, this is who I am, etc., and to stick by it. We view that as kind of, I guess you could say, a lack of immaturity on the part of baby boomers. So my point being, not so much to rag on the baby boomers, but to say, if there's certain things millennials can't do that baby boomers can do, there's lots of things baby boomers can't do that millennials can do. And there is going to always be these differing definitions. And that's just kind of part of reality. Now, the other part of this, I think, is expectations. And I think we as kind of a society, I'm sorry I'm saying society so much, have kind of lost track of what an expectation is, or why we have certain social expectations. It's because it's better. I'll give you an example from Mark Stein. So something that irritates him is whenever you have mass shootings, the men just kind of meekly sit there and let themselves get shot. They don't throw themselves on the mass shooter to try to protect their wives or girlfriends. And that the media always gives them a pass for this. Now, people have said to him, well, Mark, if you were in this case, you'd be pissing yourself hiding under the table. And he's like, maybe I would, but it's better if we have the social expectation that men are brave and that they stand up in situations like that than to just assume cowardice. I think it's the same thing with a lot of aspects of adulthood or being a man or that kind of thing. the idea isn't there isn't really a perfect man. It's not like there's some guy who's the perfect man out there, and if you just act exactly like him, then you're going to be set. No, it's a set of ideals that are based on tradition, culture, the biological and psychological realities of a male. And they're kind of there as a guiding point to try to show you what's best for yourself personally and what's best for the broader society. And these things are meant to be very broad, and there is a lot of diversity within it, like legitimate diversity where a lot of people approach masculinity, for instance, in different ways. Like some people are more kind of stoic and reserved about it and just kind of bear the sufferings of life without complaint. Some people are more kind of like raging, and they just kind of they stand up for themselves, they take what they want, that kind of thing. There's a lot of different ways of expressing masculinity or femininity. And I mean, there's obviously right ways and wrong ways of doing this kind of thing, but there's often a lot of different right ways, and they overlap, and they aren't often mutually exclusive. My point is, there's lots of different ways to define someone as being an adult, and just because someone meets the definition of being an adult in some ways and not in others doesn't mean they're not an adult. I think how a lot of people view adulthood is kind of one day you're a child, the next day you're an adult. That's often how it's kind of portrayed in fiction. I think wrongly. I think oftentimes it is for the best of intentions to try to, I guess, kind of psychologically help people kind of make that transition. But at the same time, it's not just, I think, the way we often view it. I think as a kid, and a lot of us here, we just assume that one day we're going to be an adult. And then all those things that didn't make sense, like what to do if someone got hurt, how to fix something if it broke on your car, paying your taxes, making complex medical decisions, always knowing what to do in a crisis, that at some point you would just be an adult. And all these things would kind of come naturally to you. You just kind of know these things. And as you kind of get older, you realize that these things are kind of a continuum. Are you more adult, and are you, like I'm in my late 20s, am I more adult than I was 10 years ago? Yeah, but was I a kid then, and am I a kid now? And was I an adult then, and am I an adult now? And it's not that simple. These things are very complicated. Like, let's say there's a millennial who's a highly successful doctor, but he comes home from work and he likes to play video games and watch anime on his giant screen TV. Does that make him a child, or does that make him an adult? Because by some ways he's extremely successful. He has a job, he finished school, he's making lots of money. He's kind of reached the ideal of adulthood, but he also still has kind of this thing you can cherry pick. So it's like a lot of millennials are living with their parents longer than maybe the previous generation was. Is that maybe just something that's changed because of economic and social circumstances? And I think it's something a lot of my generation is kind of self-conscious about. Like if we're ever watching a movie or something and there's a teenager or someone younger than us and we start kind of identifying with them, we go, "Oh my God, it's true. I've never grown up. That's why I'm identifying with this 60-year-old. That's why I'm kind of identifying with their angst or their teenage angst or their existential crisis or something." And it's just like there's not a switch that's flipped, that these things just go away, that you don't have like angst like you did as a teenager, that you don't have childish thoughts, that you don't have maybe some interests you had as a child. There isn't a clear delineation on these ways. Not all of us age in the same way, and not all of it is really, I guess you could say, progressive. Not all of the stuff that sometimes comes with adulthood is a good thing. Not all of it is sometimes a bad thing. These things are just very complicated. If you're like talking about maturity, there's lots of people I knew growing up who would be maybe 12, 13, 14, and they'd be much more mature than 30 or 40-year-olds, just in terms of how wise they were, how well adjusted they were, how well they could kind of weather the various issues around life. So my point being, kind of the differentiation between childhood and adulthood, I don't think is that clear. I think a lot of it is kind of socially constructed. And once again, social constructions aren't a bad thing. It doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean it's not useful. What I just mean is there is that aspect to it. There's a certain context that boomers bring into this, and a certain context that millennials bring into this. And they have very different ideas because they grew up in very different environments. And finally, this is something that I always like to just say. Other people are a black box. They're ultimately kind of a mystery to you. You don't know what's going on in their heads. You don't know how insecure they are. You don't know if they know what they're doing or not. All of us just kind of oftentimes will fake it till we make it. I know it's a cliche, but it's very true. Just because, like, especially when you're a kid and your social intelligence isn't necessarily well developed, and you see the adults around you and they always seem to know what to do they really know what to do, or is that just kind of your impression because you can't like see inside their minds? They could know like as little as you do about the situation. They've just had much more time to practice seeming like they know what to do in a particular situation. And also just it can be very hard to perceive these things. Like I said, you can't read other people's minds, you can't see inside of their souls. So I get that this video was long and rambly, but hopefully it was kind of interesting. Hopefully I kind of hit some of the marks I was going for. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. God bless, and more content to come.